Chapter 4. The Iron Giant Falls. The old Iron Giant didn't fall all at once. It rusted. First it was the smell. Crossett had always smelled like money if you were from Ashley County. That sharp, eggy bite in the air told you the mill was cooking, bleaching, steaming, pressing. It told you trucks were running and checks were being written. The folks who moved in from outside would wrinkle their noses. But people like Harlan, he breathed it deep. He remembered riding in the cab with his daddy when the wind would shift and the smell would hit. "That's the smell of Papa's timber getting paid," his father would say, grinning behind the wheel. But the smell started to fade around 2017. Then it was the noise. Fewer trucks, shorter stacks, less bark in the air. Then came the rumors. No new hiring, then early retirements, then strategic pivoting, the kind of language that smelled worse than sulfur. In 2019, the Crossett Pulp Mill officially shut down its bleached board operations. 82 years of local wood going in and clean product coming out. Over. Just like that. But for Harlan, it wasn't just a headline. It was a wound. They didn't just close a mill, they closed the pulpwood market, the whole reason uneven age forestry worked in the first place. That's what the clipboard boys and the corporate fellers didn't understand. You can't just take out one rung and expect the ladder to stand. Sustainable forestry depends on every part of the tree having value. Saw timber's where the money is, but to grow a good saw log, you need to manage the stand. That means thinnings, removals, fire, and that meant pulp. The tops, the crooks, the young growth, they weren't waste, they were cash flow. They were what kept a woods crew fed while the good logs matured. Without pulp buyers, those trees stayed in the woods. They crowded out the crowns. They made fuel beds for fire and headaches for silviculture. And what the Crossett Mill became wasn't a buyer, it was a converter. They weren't processing timber anymore. They were repulping baled pulp market pulp from somewhere else. Brazil, maybe. Canada. Places with cheap labor and short memory. That's what stung most. Not just that the market was gone, but that their wood, Ashley County wood, was no longer part of the equation. The people who'd lived and cut and planted and burned and replanted for generations were suddenly irrelevant. Their grit didn't matter, their methods didn't matter. They weren't local assets. They were asterisked footnotes in a Koch Industries press release. And you couldn't just switch mills. The few pulp buyers left were hours away, Domtar and Ashdown maybe. But they didn't want small haulers. They didn't want old trucks and small cuts. They wanted scale, machine cuts, contractor fleets. 40-ton monsters with fleets of leased trucks backed by investors and tech dashboards. Guys like Harlan didn't fit. Most of his contemporaries had already thrown in the towel or leased on with someone else. That was the new model, designed contract services. A man could sell his truck or lease it to a mega carrier like J.B. Hunt, drive under their logo, and let them handle dispatch, maintenance, and even fuel cards. They called it independence. Harlan called it what it was, glorified company driving. That dog won't hunt. He remembered a talk at the Huddle House with a buddy named Curtis, one of the last independent pulp haulers in Hamburg. Curtis had signed on to a big outfit, got the new Freightliner, traded his CB for a headset. Hell, Harlan, it's all upside. They pay you, fix the truck, even got you a hotel if your log time runs out. Harlan just nodded and sipped his coffee. Curtis leaned in. "You ought to think about it. Lease your rig. They said they'd even let you keep the old Ford for farm work." That was the last time Harlan saw Curtis. Next week he'd heard Curtis got tangled up with some DOT mess in Tarcana. The Freightliner got impounded. Curtis was stuck without a truck or a check. Turns out owning nothing means you own nothing. And that's when Harlan started walking Papa's Grove again. The white oaks there had been part of the family plan since the 40s. They'd never been cut. Too slow growing, too valuable. Papa called him the bank account. They stood in quiet rows, wide-crowned and stately, rising from fire-managed understory. Turkeys roosted in 'em, bob-wire quail flushed along the edge. And now, as the pulpwood market evaporated and the mills turned into middlemen, those oaks began to glow in Harlan's mind. He'd read about a new shortage. Barrel-stave grade white oak was drying up. The big distilleries were scrambling, trying to outbid one another for mature trees with tight rings and perfect heartwood. And it just so happened that Harlan Wykes had about 8 acres of the finest, fire-raised, pawpaw-planted white oak in the state. No middleman, no lease, no focus group, no spreadsheet. Just a truck, a load, a direction. He looked at the old iron giant once more, silent now, a rusted colossus behind chain-link fence. Then he turned his eyes east, toward Kentucky, toward a door he would open himself, with grit. For 82 years, that mill was the heart of Ashley County's timber economy. It was the constant, reliable buyer for the one product that made the entire Wicks family philosophy work: pulpwood. Harlan's Portison worldview was simple, forged by his grandfather's pragmatic adoption of the Crossett method. You don't cut out and get out, you manage. You thin the forest, taking out the small, the diseased, the crowded trees to let the high-value saw timber grow tall and straight. This was good forestry. But this thinning, this essential single-tree selection, produced mountains of pulpwood. The Crossett method depended on a market for those thinnings. The pulpwood was the economic prerequisite for sustainable long-term saw timber management. Without a local buyer for the low-grade pulp, good forestry was no longer good business. The whole system, that dog won't hunt. And in 2019, the giant fell. Georgia Pacific, under Koch Industries, announced the wild change. They ceased bleached board operations. That was the corporate speak. Harlan, from his boots-on-the-ground perspective, knew what it really meant. The mill didn't just downsize, it fundamentally changed its diet. Harlan looked over at the sprawling silent facility, the wood yard, the very yard where he and his father and his papa had waited in line with short log pulpwood trucks, was shut down. The mill no longer processes virgin pulp directly. He'd heard the talk. The mill had become a converting plant. They used repulping machines now. They processed baled market pulp, purchased or transported dried paper stock trucked in from some other mill in some other state or maybe even another country. It was the ultimate absurdity. A paper mill sitting in the middle of the most productive pine forest in the world, and it was importing its pulp. This single event was the wild change that had broken the local economy. It killed the old-school model of the independent pulpwooder. It was why there were fewer and fewer guys like him left, and why most folks were just leasing their futures to J.B. Hunt. Harlan put the truck in gear. The giant was dead, and it had severed his roots. His local pulpwood market was gone. His family's 100-year-old method was broken. This was the crisis, and it was why his '79 Ford was pointed toward Kentucky.